Welcome everybody to Oregon State University office hours number 6 for the OSU PDC PRO. Great to see you folks, and thanks for jumping back in the new year here. We're going to start with, we've got one question today, and so we're going to get that question. If anybody else wants to add a question while I'm answering this one, happy to do so. And then what we might do is we might then go through some of the upcoming assignments and just talk a little bit about what's coming up and what to keep in mind about. And if anybody has any other questions, we'll go from there. So jumping into this, I'm just going to share my screen. So a question from Lindsay about soil. The photo above is one of my soil samples. All 3 of my jars look identical. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. Is it possible they don't have any sand or silt? I think the top skinny layer is clay. This was cultivated farmland just a few years ago. The soil looked the same all the way to the bottom of the perk hole I dug. Can't figure out how to read this and mark it on the triangle. The ribbon test, no gritty feel, felt sticky, smooth, and was easily moldable. I got 1.5 to 2% ribbons on 2 jars and 1 ribbon on the other. Okay, Linz, so looking at this, has it settled out anymore, or is it still homogeneous like this?
It's been like that. Like, it's been sitting for honestly weeks by the time I got to it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. And you used a little bit of soap and you really broke it apart and aggregated it when you did it originally, right?
Yeah, I shook it up really good. And it took a couple of days. Like, the top part was a little bit murky before it really settled.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So yeah, it looks like to me, as I take a look at your ribbon test, I'm not a huge fan of the shake jar test. I know it's something that OSU really wants people to do because it gets them into soil and moves things around and gives a visual. But when you're working in the field, the ribbon test is really something you can do anywhere. And as you build a feel for it and understanding it, you can get a better sense of it. So what it looks like you have, and this is one of those things that isn't always explained in the shake jar conversation, is it looks like you have a bit of what's called dispersive clay. And this is very common when you're in and around Saskatchewan. So basically what that means is that there's a dispersive clay that doesn't always come out of solution and tends to actually coat everything else, because it looks like you have quite a bit of silt and quite a bit of clay in this material. And so that 1 to 2 inch ribbon really lets you know if it's holding together and it looks fully homogenized, that this has quite a bit of clay in it. But if the clay isn't separating out, it's usually dispersive clay because it ends up coating all the other particles. So it coats the sand, it coats the silt, and it also makes it hard for it to settle out. And so what'll happen is when you turn that, does it look like the material moves with the jar, or does it look like the material stays stock in the jar?
I haven't really tried that. It kind of, from when I was just moving it around trying not to like wiggle it, it kind of looked like it was staying put. But like within, if you blow up the picture big enough, you can see there's lots of like little holes and things throughout. Like it never really settled and compacted itself. Like, it looks like it's quite airy and fluffy almost. I don't know.
Yeah, and see, this is one of the pieces about this method that you don't really get a sense of the organic matter. And so it looks like there's actually a fair bit of organic matter in this from the coloration. Looks like we've got some humic acid and some fulvic acid as well. So I would say that you're probably into a clay, like the clay side of loam, and moving towards the clay side of that loam triangle versus moving towards the sand side, because it looks like, you know, you do have some particle sizes down at the bottom, so it might be there. But again, that ribbon test from what you're saying, so if we go over to the ribbon piece and just walk it down, you know, is it too dry, is it too wet, does the soil remain in a ball when squeezed? And it sounds like it does, right? Can you form one? Yeah. Are you at 1 to 2? Yeah. Does it feel gritty? No. Neither gritty nor smooth. Does it feel very smooth? So you're at that clay loam, or that silty clay loam is where I would place your soil just from your ribbon test.
Okay, that's from like digging the hole and just looking at it and knowing that it's like previously cultivated like farmland for decades. It seemed like there was a lot of organic matter in that top part, but okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the thing as we get into hydration and working with hydration, when you have a higher organic matter content, you have a higher water holding capacity. So basically, a percent of organic matter per acre is roughly 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity. You move up a percentage, it's another 20,000 gallons on average, or 80,000 liters. So when you have clay, the way that these particle sizes work, you've got sand, which is gigantic, and it has the lowest surface area for the volume. Then you have silt, and then you have clay. So if you've got that clay that's coming out, it means that the water holding capacity of the soil is actually pretty good. And the organic matter also is an advantage to you. So it sounds like on both those levels, you've got something to be working with. It also means that when you're working with something that's a bit more clay, it means your watering regime, if and when you get to a watering conversation, especially around the house, if you're doing gardens, it's probably going to be more frequent, but less volume, only because clay takes a longer time to suck up that water. And when it does, it holds on to it longer. So what you're looking at is frequency. Whereas if you're working with more of a sandy or a porous soil, you want larger waterings because you need to actually come in and coat all of those particles.
Okay.
Great question. How did everybody else find the soil tests? How's that been going for folks?
I actually had a similar difficulty as Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one area where I felt like it was almost all clay, but when I did the jar test, it didn't look like it had that layer of clay, but I felt like it should have that because it like the drainage wasn't good, it wasn't draining well. It just seemed like the water was sitting for hours without draining, and so I was confused also. I may actually, if I can figure it out, upload some of my pictures to have you look at them by the time that's on
Sure.
the question form because of that. But then also the sometimes it seemed like there should be organic matter in it too, but it just felt really clay-like, especially when I was doing the ribbon testing. And then there was also in another area, like, I don't know if I'm not getting the technique for the ribbon testing down right, but it just seemed to be falling apart where I couldn't get any sort of ribbon at all. But it felt like there should still be clay in it because I thought that I saw clay in the soil itself. But I'll upload some of those.
Are you in an urban site, Lenny?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you get into urban sites, because of development, because of the amount of interruption and interaction with the soil, you end up with what's called urban mosaic. And the reason agrologists have used this term is because it's everything. It's the kitchen soup. It's the kitchen sink. It's they've churned and brought in fill and they've brought in topsoil. And so the thing about urban sites is that they tend to be this diversity of the parent soil, the topsoil that was pre-existing, then the development, then the backfill, then whatever the homeowners have put in and on there for years. So it's a very diversified soil set. The cool thing about that is it's really easy to remediate. And that's why things like lasagna gardening have worked so well and raised beds have worked so well. Like it's a very easy soil to remediate. Working on Lindsay's scale, you're on a much larger scale and it takes more work. But in an urban situation, there tends to be more disruption because there's more concentration of people. And with that concentration, you tend to get this urban mosaic. So what you'll find is, I think your mindset is, I'm looking for a unified type of soil type, and you're not going to find it. What you're finding is that confirmation that you're living in an urban site. So what'll happen is the way that you're going to approach your soil building will be reflective of that, in that you're going to want to say, okay, well, I'm going to place my garden beds. I'm going to place these pieces for their aesthetic value, for their location to the house, for their location to potentially be self-watered by the house, for the walkability and how whoever is the client of the house, how they're walking around the house and how they're interacting with the house. And then as you get into the soil building structure, you're going to say, great, what do I have around me? And that's part of the soil assignment is, okay, what do I have around me? What can I use to build soil? And if you have if you have materials like your greens and your browns, and you can layer them, and you can do that, fantastic. If you're in a place where you don't have that, and for me out here, I have horse manure, which for me is my favorite way to build soil, because horses already pre-process the hay down into material. Their feces can break down into soil in a year, and usually within 3 months I can plant into it or less. Whereas things like chicken manure is too hot, cow manure is too hot, it has to be composted because it has such a high nitrogen content. So basically it'll burn the plants that we placed it upon. Alpaca and llama poop is the gold standard in terms of readily accessible feces that can be used directly on garden. It doesn't burn whatsoever. But for you, I think your big question is, are you going to be doing raised beds or in ground beds? And if it is raised beds, then you're going to bring in material anyways. And it's a pretty easy conversation in urban sites. Usually we'll dig down a bit, we'll fill with decomposing wood, not using any volatiles like no cedar, no juniper, unless it's really decomposing and you can see the myceliation decomposing. And then on top of that, we're going to put any type of soil that we can have access to. And sometimes it's taking the sod. What I'll do with raised garden beds is I'll cut out the sod, flip that over, take up any of the topsoil that's there. And in urban sites, sometimes it's half an inch, sometimes it's a foot, it just depends. Take that out, place that aside. I'll build my bed. And then in the hole, in the cavity that's below grade, I'll fill with wood. If I have the ability to feed that bed with overflow water, I will. I'll put in the piping for that. And then what I'll do is right on top of the wood, I'll put on that sod upside down. So I bury the sod so it decomposes and becomes soil as well. And then I'll fill back up with what I have. So I think for your situation, that's probably what I would lean to, thinking a little bit more about your site. But I imagine you'll find differences, and everybody will, with shake jar tests and ribbon tests in urban sites, because it is so diverse.
Yeah, just in the 3 places where I tested on my small site, I got completely different results too.
Yeah.
And so what with urban mosaic is that if I was, I don't know, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding where I might classify that in the triangle. Or
yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. So what we want to do with the assignment is, I want to know that you can read either the ribbon test or the shake dart test and put it onto the triangle. So what you might say is, okay, on site 1, the ribbon test produced silty loam, and yet only 12 feet away I did another one and it was a clay loam, and yet another 12 feet away it was a sandy loam. And then what I would do is I would put a note, and this is true for everyone on all assignments. If your site does not conform to what's there, you just say, well, this doesn't conform. My hypothesis is that because it's urban mosaic and there's development and there's churning of soil and whatnot, it's very, very different. And so because of that, I'm going to approach this soil building with these strategies. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to take like this bird's eye view of, okay, what is soil? How do we work with it? What's the living component? What's the non-living component? How do we test it? How do we understand what that soil texture is? Because again, soil texture doesn't have anything to do with biologicals. And then after you have that biological conversation understood, then, okay, what am I going to do about it? So again, for the assignment, it's really just show your work always. Okay, well, we did this, we tried this. There's a bit of a note. It's an urban mosaic. It wasn't totally uniformed. I imagine if I went every single foot, I would find something a little different, which is what I would expect. So just take a note of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another quick question, you mentioned dispersive clay as like sometimes you won't get the reading of clay because it's mixed with the other stuff.
Yeah.
If that's the case, the dispersive clay can be anywhere on the triangle in the clay section, right?
Yeah, but you'd never be able to understand it from either test. So it's sort of a next level of soil analysis. Once you've done the shake jar test or the ribbon test, and really dispersive clay is interesting because when you do the ribbon test, what'll happen is you'll get pockets of the ribbon that'll crunch out, like they'll be large particle size and they'll fall apart, but then you'll have areas around it that are perfectly formed like clay is. And then when you have it in the jar, it'll be there because clay usually takes anywhere from 3 to 4 months to completely settle out of a shake jar test. It's one of those things where depending on the particle size, it'll take so long, and also what's in the water. So this is something else that has another effect. So if you have certain types of minerals within that water, that clay will stay in suspension. It won't flocculate and it won't stratify out. So if what happens is you take the jar and you turn it, what'll happen is you'll get these sort of currents in the soil, and you'll get something that'll move left and something that'll move right. And basically it's because the clay, the dispersive clay has become attached to certain particles, but not to others. And so you get these independent areas that are moving, kind of like if you had a bunch of bangles on a wrist and you were moving them, they could move independently of each other. It's very similar with that shake jar test. They'll move. So again, I would just take a note, but that'll be something that you'd really have to know what you were looking for. So again, you would do the shake jar test and you would move it, and if it held there, probably means that it's not dispersive, but it is slow to stratify clay, whereas dispersive clay really never settles and never impedes the movement of that soil. So it's always sort of in a liquid state. Problem with dispersive clays is that when you place a building on dispersive clays, they do just that. They disperse, and you get a weird settling of buildings and a weird settling of structures that go on top of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to check and see. Nope, no new questions. Does anybody else have a question before we jump on to some of the assignments that are coming up, and just spot check those? Or anybody have any questions about the water assignment or anything like that that they wanted to jump into?
I have one.
Go for it.
I already posted my soil assignment Friday, past Friday, but I did a you know how at the beginning of every assignment there's a little box for how to do the assignment of you know, it's like OSU assignment. It's a little blue box.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I was doing the soil assignments, you know, the percolation test, and then there's they said for people who can't dig, which I'm not able to dig on this site, so I did the kind of in the video, it's kind of PVC pipe over the top, which I remember you mentioned. I missed that meeting, but I remember you mentioned that's different. That's an infiltration test.
Yeah.
So I did that test instead. So
nice.
Mine is a little bit different. And I have yeah, the shake jar test. I was kind of like disappointed with some things because, you know, I wasn't able to get, you know, the right jars. I wasn't able to get good lighting. It was freezing outside when I was doing them.
Totally.
And but yeah, I'm sure you'll look over them when you review my
no worries. Yeah, and really the main thing is, do you understand the concept? Do you understand that an infiltration test, a percolation test, these are tests to understand how much water and how quickly does that water is absorbed into the soil. And that gives us a sense of watering, that gives us a sense of confirmation in terms of what our soils are doing, how they're operating. And tests like that are actually more indicative of organic matter because it includes it. What you'll find is if you go out into the world and you go into this work full time, you'll find that irrigation calculators are devoid of organic matter, regardless of the fact that organics can hold substantially more water than soil texture. So sand, silt, and clay. So when you get into that level of understanding and when you get into these assignments, it's really to build a qualitative understanding and a quantitative understanding of how to work with soils and what are some of these markers. When we get into more soil tests, tests like biological assays, so on a square foot, 30 centimeter square foot, how many insects are we seeing? What's the type of ground cover? Is it covering 100% or 20% or 30%? How many earthworms are we seeing? Earthworms are a great indicator for total biological health within the soil because they're one of these apex predators. It's like taking a look at a pair of breeding jaguars or panthers in a rainforest. If you have them, there's an entire structure of organisms beneath them. And so similarly with the earthworms, when you're in that soil and looking for earthworms, if you see a lot of them, you can know that that soil structure is high. This is one of the reasons why in compost, we see so many earthworms, because if we're actively managing a compost with a high degree of efficacy, we'll see a lot of earthworms because we're creating the environments for breeding of microarthropods, protozoa, nematodes, fungi, bacteria. That entire soil food web that's beneath the ground is growing really well. So the big thing there, Jonas, is, did you understand the process? Did you produce a result from it? Do you feel like you could replicate it when it's not freezing outside? As I've got 2 feet of snow, I couldn't do any of this right now. And then when you're doing, or if you go into this work full time, just letting clients know, and this might be a bigger conversation, but letting clients know that if you take them on in the winter, there will be tests that cannot be completed until freshet and spring melt. So it took me years to realize that I on large scale projects, definitely not urban projects, but large scale projects, I was looking at least a 6 to a 12 month design process. And that's my process. That's what I enjoy. I work with colleagues that are like, as soon as it's done, it's out the door. But I really want to visit the site 2 or 3 times over the seasons to understand it. I feel, for me, it's important to see that seasonality change and to understand the site. I'll never understand the site as well as the client because I don't live there.
Yeah.
So part of this work is helping to educate them. And so I'll give a lot of these tests and assignments that you folks are doing, I'll give them to my clients to start doing regularly and start gathering data and start learning. You'll find that with clientele, you'll find there are the highly motivated and the like, this is what I want to do. And you'll find the like, do it for me clients. And eventually you'll have to decide who you want to work with. I love working with the DIYers. I don't mind working for the do it for me, but my price goes up because it's so much more work and I'm taking that on. So you can think about it as sort of a concierge service all the way to an a la carte. Like, I'm going to do this. I will be present with you all the way. I will do everything for you. Or on the other side, I will teach you and I will grow with you and I will help you understand this process as we build this. So that's more of a business conversation, which I'm always happy to have, but it all comes back down to these basics of how are you working with the soil assignment and do you understand it? And if you don't, what are the things that you need to build more competency in, which will then produce confidence?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of did feel that, even though I struggled a little bit, I think I kind of got the whole picture of things, because the jar test for me, I mean, it still kind of showed that, I had a sandy urban-filled soil and I think the ribbon test, I think I had a similar problem with it that other people had. It's just like, not sure what I'm looking for. I kind of but squeezing the ribbon, I'm kind of like, I think I sort of forced it through to where I wanted it to be instead of kind of letting it break. So it ended up being a little bit longer than it should have, I think.
And this speaks a little bit to the fact that our literacy around even our bodies and our physicality is low. Like, having an assignment, and I was the same 10 years ago when I started, I'm like, what am I feeling here? I remember my instructor at the time, he's a good colleague and friend now, being like, what do you mean, what are you feeling? I'm like, was it gritty or is it smooth? And he had a full facepalm moment. He's like, I don't know what to tell you if you don't know what gritty and smooth is. But it was a bigger conversation about literacy. And it's like, how many times do we actually feel the soil in front of us? And so one of the things that's really important about this is that if you come across a gap, which is what I'm hearing, so there's a gap of proxemics and physicality, it's time to touch a lot of soil. It's time to touch 2 or 3, 4, 5, 20 times, going out into a garden center, going out into a climate when you can, and you've got bared earth, and digging things up and starting to feel them and going, oh, this is grittier than this. Now I have 2 data points. And then you're taking another one. It's like, oh, this is smoother than this. Okay, smooth. And then as you do that, you build your ribbons out of it, and you go, oh, interesting. The smooth builds more ribbons, but the gritty doesn't. Okay, that makes sense. And so you're building that comprehension that when you have large particle sizes of things that don't create tensional strength like clay does, it breaks apart. Okay, now we're starting to build more comprehensive understanding. And then as you move into other places, like I first experienced dispersive clay in Kenya, where we were digging a borehole, which is a well, went down about 100 feet, dug by hand. And as we got to a certain strata, there was a complete change in that coloration. So we went from a red iron quartz soil, and there's quartz literally in the soil. Then you get into the strata of really interesting clay that you can see that the material on top of it isn't settling. And so the only way to learn this is to go and be in the field. I know a lot of folks will read the books and it'll just run over you. You have to go out, you have to be in the field, you have to touch a lot of soils, you have to touch, potting mixes to go, oh, they've thrown a bunch of peat in here. This is just organics. There's actually no parent material. This is just peat with a little bit of burnt fish soil. So fish soil is something they'll do. They'll create these massive composting processes off of the fishing industry, and they'll do it just to get a dark dye really to it, and then they'll mix that into soil because the public has been misled to believe that dark soil is good soil. But you can burn your acids, you can burn your humates, you can really create that structure where it comes off of it. So go and play in the soil is my suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. Kind of the muscle memory in the hand, you kind of learn it over time.
Yeah. It's interesting when you get into this work, there'll be a lot of conversations like, well, it's like kneading a loaf of bread. 9 out of 10 people are like, I don't know what that's like. I've never kneaded a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
And so, when you're working in, I got into this work through natural building. So I was building clay homes and working with plasters. And they would say that. They would be like, it's like kneading a loaf of bread. I'm like, yeah, nothing. And so it's one of the things they did in the workshop, because it was a 2-3 month workshop, is we started baking bread. So we could all learn something that the majority of humanity has known since the advent of agriculture 14,000 years ago, but very few people understand. So part of this is a rewilding and a renurturing and creating more literacy yourself of your environment and your ecology and all the rest of it. And so it's interesting because you'll come to a course and you'll be like, I don't really know that. I need to go figure that out. I need to go play in the soil. I need to go bake some bread. And it just opens up more avenues. And I think this is why for folks, permaculture in particular can be an opening of a door to a lifetime of work that never gets boring. Because even if you switch, let's say you go from energy, or you start in gardening and you go to energy, and from energy you go, oh, I'm really interested in heating, and from heating you're like, I'm really interested in wood heating, and you become a masonry wood stove or masonry heater. Well, that's a very specific niche and a very specific conversation that really suits you as an individual. And I speak about this because a good colleague of mine, when we started together, that's what they do. They build European masonry heaters now. That's what they do full time. But they started in a permaculture course because they were like, well, I'm interested in it all. And then they realized that for them, who they are as a person, how they're expressed as an individual, it came down to working with their hands, building something that was done. He hated building soil because it was never done. He hated growing food because you had to monitor it and you had to maintain it. But what he loved was masonry heaters. And so masonry heaters were created during the Little Ice Age in Europe about 400 years ago, because it got so cold so quickly, we had to reinvent technology. And what a masonry heater does is it has a small firebox, and then it goes through a number of hypocausts, air flues. So basically what you're doing is you're taking all the BTUs, all the energy out of a piece of wood that you burn, and you're sinking it into high U value. U value is the ability for a material to hold thermal mass and hold that, just like the heart that has the heat, the majority of the heat in our body, and radiate out. And so you can use these masonry heaters where you do one fire in the morning and one fire in the evening. And that, massive stone radiates heat out throughout a 12 or a 10-hour cycle. But the big conversation is, be open to what delights you in this work, be open to what excites you. Like you may come across soils and go, nope, not for me. Or you may come across rainwater harvesting and go, I like working with calculations and pipes and I like fitting things together. And or you may come across this and go, I'm really interested in working with people and communities and conversations. And that's as big of a part of permaculture as anything, because it is a design approach. It's not just landscape design. It's really, how do we stay on the planet as if we intend to stay? So I would just say be open to it. And then as you're working with these tools and skills, find where your knowledge gaps are. And just as much as you have interest, seek to fill those gaps. If you don't know what soil feels like, go out and play with a bunch of soils.
Okay. Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions before we go on to assignments coming up? Okay, so we're a week away from the soil assignment being due. So I'm just going to quickly go over this. You may have some of this information, you may not. You may have the farmland classification, typical profile, drainage, things of that nature, and you may not. So usually in America through NRCS, you're going to find this information directly on the NRCS soil map. If you're in Canada, there is a soil map of Canada. It's not great. Most of the provincial maps have been updated. BC is probably the best. Well, Ontario and BC are probably the best. Saskatchewan, I don't know, Lindsay, what you'll be able to find. I know previous students have been able to find good pieces. Then we get into our soil testing. So where are the sites? And really we want to make sure that we put these little icons exactly where they are. So I've got a sense of it, and also your clients have a sense of it. Part of this, like this process of going through these assignments, is me training you about how to build this comprehension for yourself, but also how to demonstrate it to the clients. Then we're going to take a look here. What's the microclimate? What's the reason tested? What's a visual description? Photos are fantastic to come back to. Such a big part of this course is getting you comfortable with taking multiple photos in the same location and really getting a sense of landmarking. So up close photo of a hole may not be as useful as a photo that also has a reference of a tree and then an up close photo. So you're always getting a sense of where you're coming from. Here, once you do your shake jar test, you're going to place your marker here, wherever it needs to go. So you're going to grab that and pull it over. And so for somebody like Lindsay, it would be shake jar test results inconclusive. And then ribbon test results would be clay loam or silty clay loam. And then from here, you can put in the image, and you can just, for you, Lindsay, you can say, well, it looks like there's like 0.5 millimeter of clay and the rest looks like a sand silt mixture. So this is why it's inconclusive. And that's really the conversation. We're wanting to show, well, here's what I found and here's why I made the conclusion I did. So limiting factors for soil type. Limiting factors are things like, it doesn't look like I have a lot of soil. There's not a lot of access to the site. This is a urban mosaic, and I'm working with a lot of different types of soil. I might be working with contamination. I may be working with chemical compaction or physical compaction. So we want to just make notes of that. Anything specific you see about your soil you want to put down here. So sometimes you're looking at, you're going, oh, it's really interesting. I'm seeing some greening, or I'm seeing some mold 2 or 3 inches down. And so you just take notes of that. Nitrogen rich greens or juices. So what are some of the nitrogen rich or green materials, and what are some of the carbons, and what are some other resources? Other resources are things like paper or things like cardboard, off cuttings, things like that, wood that you have access to. And then what are the top goals for building soil on site? And so when you go back to a lot of your weaknesses and a lot of your threats of your SWOT analysis up to this point, that's where I'd mine a lot of what my goals will be. So it's a super dry environment. So I'm trying to build water holding capacity, or I have 2 inches of soil before bedrock. So I'm trying to build up, or I know that my soil currently is really good in water holding capacity, but I'm wondering if it has contamination. So I'm going to test, I'm going to go through these processes and work with this. So you want to put in your goal, when this might happen, and what are the resources needed or the process that will get you there. How is your soil building plan responding to limiting factors that you noticed in your soil test? So again, going back to limiting factors. So really connecting those two. And then again, this is the summation. So what are the strengths of your soil? What are the weaknesses of the soil, the opportunities there and the threats, and final thoughts. Again, assignment conclusion is your way of showcasing your designer mind evolution. Looking at the soil in this way, I've come to the conclusion that I need to build soil. Here are the 3 ways I'm thinking of doing it. I'm choosing way 1 because I have the materials for that. I'm going to check in with that soil every year or every bi-year. I'm going to make sure that I do it every 6 months. I'm going to take these metrics of the soil and start building the metrics in this way. All of that is your way of approaching this and showing that you understand the conversation. Questions about the soil assignment? Feel comfortable with that? Okay. Local ecology survey. Again, we don't always have all this information. Some places have incredible biological assays. British Columbia is a great one. We have biological assays all the way down to the micro region, and most provinces in Canada do. America is a little bit different. They have some states that are incredibly well versed and some that aren't, and internationally it varies quite dramatically. So what we are trying to address, and you may find this and you may not, is we're trying to understand what's the successional process. Because once we get to disturbance, whenever there's a site disturbance, we are interrupting the pattern that the ecology has evolved into over time. So we've got a climate ecology in every single one of our climax. And I make no difference between a climax forest and a climax prairie, or no difference between a climax savanna and a climax maritime. There's just a climax expression. There's an expression in the biology and the flora and the fauna. And in that expression, we're trying to understand what this land is natively, naturally moving towards and where it is in that successional process. And the value of this is understanding, well, if it's in a shrub succession and the focus of our site is to create a berry farm, we actually want to stall the succession of this site at a berry shrub level. We don't want it to go faster and fire and all the rest of it, because that changes the composition of our soil in terms of biology. It changes the water holding capacity and distribution of that site. All of those things change. And so the point here isn't to say all sites all over the world have to be climax, but what are the different stages and at what stage is this site? So for Lindsay on the prairies, you're going to have smaller clumps potentially of shrublands or thickets, but generally we're not moving to a major tree conversation. And this is why in some of the conversations we've had, Lindsay, had they started with more pioneer species, some of those conifers might be further along, but because they're working with deciduous trees and they're working with them at a high caliper, they take a bit longer to establish and to create that root system. And so you take that as a learning and then you build upon it. We're trying to say, have you found these aspects on the site? So what have you found? What haven't you found? And it might be completely missing. That's totally fine. This is just a snapshot. We're trying to challenge you to know more about your birds in your area. And the reason for this is that none of these different biological elements are separate. They are all of ecology. And when you get into Indigenous languages, it's amazing how much the Indigenous languages for different elements in ecology are attached to and connected to different elements. Definitely down in the Amazon basin, so much of their language is connected to the tree. And so many of the language names for birds and for animals are of this tree, of this ecology, because this is the ecology, the home of it. As we take a look at local food chain, we're trying to get you to understand further and to demonstrate that you understand that these chains and webs are interconnected and they have connection. And then again, taking a look at the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is really about, so looking at your ecology, I'm seeing a lot of diversity in one area, but not a lot in another. So that might be a weakness. We don't have a lot of diversity here, or that diversity is completely lacking. And that's really in an urban site. What's the threat of having that lack of diversity? It means that your site is not as resilient. So if you're only having one element or two elements or three elements within the successional cycle, when disturbance comes, not if, when disturbance comes, it's going to be a little bit more vulnerable or a little bit more fragile. So as we get into building anti-fragility, which is the ability to come back from any sort of calamity or black swan in a way that allows for further regeneration, we are looking at building multiple systems. And this is why working at scale, so working with tree systems and working with shrub systems and working with in-ground systems and aquatic systems is so important, because eventually you'll have a year that something will fail. And so we just bring that in. Questions about local ecology survey. How's that feeling to everybody? Thumbs up, pretty good. Feeling confident? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I haven't really like touched any of the pages yet. I've just done some online research, but so far, my guess is that it's a climax forest of like those scrubby oak trees, and then with white pines. But it's just, I don't know. There's no native forest left, so it's hard to tell. And it's like there's marshes. Marshes are a big thing in the region of just like the Boston area.
Yeah.
Because it once was just a giant marsh.
Yeah.
Fill in land. So it's just, I'm not sure. And then the site is on fill land. So I don't know, like if you mow down the site, would it turn into a forest, or would it stay like a scrub land full of, goldenrod and milkweed and
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, so in urban sites on coastal areas, and I love that you brought this up, Jonas, is a lot of it has been built up. So it's land that was reclaimed from sea, and a lot of it was marsh or a maritime area. So it's got an estuary, or it's got a riparian interactive ecotone. And so what you have to do then is you have to research, what was this before we were here, or what is this further out from the city? So if you are looking that most of Boston was a marsh, that'll be the climax ecology. It's not going to be a forest. There might be some taller expressions of plants, but it's not necessarily going to be that type of forest. Now on fill land, chances are you have an opportunity to not have a climax marsh, but you have an opportunity to have a climate forest. So again, in that climatic region, you're going to look at areas that aren't riparian based, but more on that ecotone where they're close to the ocean, but they're not necessarily inundated with the water. So they're usually a little bit higher up. So we kind of have to cognitively look at the difference there and go, okay, if we go further north or further south of Boston, when we have a little bit of a break between urban centers, and we might have to go quite far, what is that ecology? And so that's reaching out to conservation organizations, biologists, biological organizations, and saying, what is this ecological blueprint that I'm seeing here on this landscape? And when you get into an urban site that is filled, because it's not purely maritime anymore in terms of its soil structure, you can play with both. It's kind of an interesting place to play. It's why there's so much diversity in urban centers. One, because you can grow quite a bit in terms of the heat island effect. Two, because of the incredible influx of different people from different cultures. And three, because you have to have a building, you have to have structural soil. And to do that, you have to move out of water. So you have an opportunity to work with potentially a different type of growing condition.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say of like people that might be specialists for those areas. Like, who would you, if you were in my place, like who would you go to contact for info?
Yeah, so first thing I would do is I would pull up a new tab, and I would go Boston Ecology. And from there, I would start to take a look at some conservation, so some environmental groups, metro educational and research. Awesome. So interdisciplinary research program in urban ecology and urban greening. Great. That would be a great person to reach out to, saying, hey, I'm taking this course. I'm looking at understanding what the ecology here, climax ecology is. That would be my first one. Okay, interesting. Now there's conservation ecology. So conservation has to do more with what was. So again, coming down, taking a look, mostly it's about education. So I'm actually looking more for associations here or groups. So I might type in association. Here we go. So Center for Ecology and Conservation again, Society for Conservation Biology. So it doesn't have to do with Boston, but has to do with the world at large. Cool. They might have more information for me. Taking a look at this, might reach out to these folks, ask them a question about conservation and biology. But basically, I would just go through a pretty standard research conversation is I'll type in the site name, I'll type in conservation biology, biology, climax ecology, climax biology, flora and fauna, and then see if there's a larger conversation. I find in the States, it's relatively easy. There's usually something either from NRCS or there's a local. In Canada, almost every single province, because we have so much space, we have such a low population density, there's so much untouched or lesser altered ecology. And so we're quite enamored with starting to classify and put all these pieces together. So I would take a look at all of those and then just start to reach out and say, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. I'm looking for this type of ecology. I'm trying to understand what the climax and what the successional ecology is, and then go from there.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, I've done one thing I found interesting about this is I sort of have almost an incomplete to complete picture because I've done so many walks along the ocean and I kind of gotten somewhat abstract idea like of the let me see like beach plums growing really well near the ocean and then wild roses. So
Right.
it does kind of giving me an idea of what grows well.
Yeah. And the more you can walk, the more you can take in, the better off you'll be, because you're again building that observational capacity, awareness capacity. So good on you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Jumping ahead, Lenny, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Go for it.
I've been having a question about resilience for a while, and I feel like maybe this is a good time to ask about it. So I'm trying to understand better I understand I think I understand what resilience means, but since taking this class, I've come across some like conflicting thoughts about it. And so when you mention environment's ability to kind of maybe come back in response to disturbance, that's what you mentioned with the climax communities, right? If there's a lot of diversity in that system, the ability for it to come back is higher and quicker, or it comes back more quickly, right? And so the duration of time that it takes to come back, is that kind of part of what resilience is?
Yeah, so
sorry, let me just give a little more context before I finish that question. One of the reasons why I'm thinking about this is I'm thinking about deserts and the life that exists in deserts. And I'm wondering if a desert has a climax community. I guess that's one question, but there's also like the ability for a desert to come back to a desert form. We think that maybe a desert shouldn't be a desert and that we want to grow stuff in it to make it more resilient. But they have all these creatures that are extremely resilient for the environment that they live in, that they do an amazing job living in that environment of a desert. And if we bring in a forested area into that desert, these creatures that are really resilient in a desert environment die away, and we lose that information, or we lose those creatures that are resilient. And so do you understand where this conflict is? Like I'm getting conflicted in this idea of resilience.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a great thought to ponder. I go back to some of the incredible biologists that I've studied and had the opportunity to learn from. And what comes up time and time again is that outside of ecology or inside of ecology, our minds and our sentimentality doesn't matter. And it's a funny statement because what it aims to do is it aims to go, all of the conversation we're having right now is one that is driven by us being present on this earth in a way that favored certain organisms over others instead of working within the carrying capacity that they had. And already we're into language. Already we're into our own language and our own viewpoint and all the rest of it. So we've already strayed into a conversation where there's an opinion.
Mhm.
And opinions are specific. They're views. We can all take a look at the exact same forest. And depending on our life experience, depending on where we're standing in that forest, depending on where we're looking, depending on what is the ability for our senses to perceive, we will perceive that forest in a dramatically different way. When it comes to classifying an ecology as being quote unquote supposed to be there or not supposed to be there, it's a very similar question that we come across when we're talking about invasives. And a colleague of mine who's been in this space for about 30 years, on the second day of a permaculture design course we used to teach together, he would offer this really interesting story about humanity. And it would be a story, we would sit around the campfire, everyone would bring their libations, and he would tell the story about how agriculture potentially started, and from the information that he had and the conversation he had about how eventually a group that was nomadic planted some of the seeds that they intentionally loved in places that they thought they could grow, or as they were having an apple on the road, they threw the core and found a place to grow. And because that was a human habituated area, these were plants that were growing in these areas. But as climate changes and naturally changes, let's say without anthropomorphic influence, we start to have changes in where different plants grow. So in many respects, the Douglas fir, because in British Columbia we have quite a bit of them and we consider them native, weren't native once you move back 5, 6, 7,000 years. And so we tend to think, well, if there was ice here, that was quote unquote bad. But it's a cycle. It's a cycle that the planet goes through in terms of its geological and its biological processes. So it's the human that brings the judgment. And it goes back to this Tom Brown, the famed outdoor skills educator, saying, what's the loudest thing in the forest? The human mind. What does it sound like? Trash can going down a suburban alleyway at 3 a.m. Because we come to these landscapes and we're going, well, what is this? What are we supposed to do with this? How are we supposed to interact with this? So your question about the deserts is a good one. And it's one that if you look out into the permaculture world, there's ardent beliefs about it on almost all sides. One, deserts are quote unquote bad and we need to stop their spread. There's another one that says deserts are ecology like anything else, and they have a climax ecology. It doesn't necessarily showcase itself in the same way that tall trees do or shrubs do, but of course there's organisms. And so I don't have a strong answer for you in that those deserts are quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. It's always specific to the individuals there and their aims and their needs and their wants. Is this something that we want to propagate? Is this something that we want to hold on to? And so it's always framed. So when we start in this course, we say, what's the client? What are their goals? What is the site? And we're starting to get a scope for it. So on a broad worldview, when we take a look at the words of regenerative, generative, and degenerative, and resilient, resilient from a textbook definition is the ability to come back to its shape or its form after major impact or deflection. So if you have a ball and you can push on that ball, and when you release on the ball and the ball has air, it comes back to its same shape. So that's resilient.
Would a desert resilient then?
It depends on the influences that are upon it. We're getting to this place to where the scope and scale and influence of humanity is creating such pressures on ecology that it's hard for them to come back to the way that they were, or to be regenerative in that they spread and grow and they create more of themselves. I would say generally deserts are quite resilient, but if we ever get an atmospheric jet stream change, which we're seeing, or if we ever get bioelectric pole shift with the magnetic sphere of the planet, we will likely see complete ecologies change in a heartbeat. So yeah, they're resilient to the point of, yeah, they can come back if somebody decides to plant trees
Yeah.
and all the rest of it there. Like my colleague and friend Neil Spackman did with the Albeida project. Sure. If those systems are ever removed, yeah, the desert will claim that back. But again, that all comes with sentimentality. That all comes with us saying the desert will. Do you see what I'm trying to drive at here?
Yeah, it seems to me like you have systems like microsystems and macro systems and in between. And resilience can be part of each of them. But the resilience of this one may change as the resilience of this one gets bigger. And so you have, like, if all of the water in the world figured out a way to evenly distribute across the land, then you probably wouldn't have many deserts at all. And so they would become extremely non-resilient. But if deserts started to spread out more and become more resilient, then all the deserts would be there. And so it's like I don't know, it's weird because we have this idea of resilience being, usually we can, because we're organisms and we want to survive, we think that resilience should be benefiting us. And so like when there's something that is really resilient, but we don't like it, then we consider it maybe a virus or a disease that's really hard to deal with, even though it's resilient. And so the idea of trying to, but then it brings the question of, like, I've been connecting, since this class, I've been connecting diversity with resilience as like something that we should strive for. And I believe that diversity is really important in that process. But then there's also that question, if you get rid of deserts because you're trying to put all these other organisms that live really well together, whereas in a desert, you don't get as many life forms in one small area. And so the diversity seems like it's less, but you have the few organisms that can survive that are extremely diverse, or unique. I guess I should say unique, maybe not diverse, but they're unique. And you're destroying these really unique creatures by bringing in diversity of other creatures, and they can't survive. And so I don't know, sorry, I'm just
That's great. We have time. It's great.
It's my what do you call it, existential crisis in my what I'm doing to the world and not knowing that. And I don't think there's an answer. I'm just,
yeah. No, it's a wonderful discussion. And I think the thing that helps me with this discussion is scope and scale. How much am I looking at? Am I looking at the desert? Am I looking at the desert and how it goes over something else? Am I looking at the world? Am I looking at diversity from a global perspective or in a small perspective? I think this is where Indigenous knowledge has a huge amount to offer us. And so I've just posted a book, Robin Callahammer, Braiding Sweetgrass. There's a few others. Okay, nice. And part of that is just becoming of a place. And there's this indigeneity that I think is starting to occur to a very strong tradition for a very long time of, we will take what we know and we will pave over what this is, and we will pave it with what we know. And what the questions you are asking are driving at a fundamental aspect of human society, which is, for years, since we were genetically stable, which is 250,000 years, and since we were within our specific phylocategory of 2.5 million years, we have had to have been observational and of a place. And over the last 200 to, let's call it 1,000 years, we have specifically created technology that has separated us from this life support system that keeps us alive. And so your questions are wonderful. They're there to drive you and to really question, and brings down to permaculture adage, which is the onus is on the designer. The designer is the one who must carry the burden of what they put into the landscape. And so for some permaculturalists or folks that use permaculture as a tool, they'll use any plant in the toolbox, regardless of its invasiveness, regardless of its ability to displace other organisms that might be more native. And the reason why I say more native is, again, once you add time to the conversation, the idea of native and non-native becomes very fluid, very, very, very fluid. It's no longer just, oh, it's this and it's that. It's like, well, let's go back 2,000 years. Tell me the scale of when this thing was here. Tell me the scale of when plants and animals brought seeds of this plant here, or animals traversed areas and found themselves to a different place. And then the balance was changed. And I think some individuals use that as a carte blanche permission for humans to do whatever they want, which is unfortunate. And so I'm not pushing anyone towards that perspective, but really to be of a place, and similar to what Jonas was talking about, is really walking a place and being in a place and going, oh, that's interesting. I'm seeing ocean plums and I'm seeing this type of rose and I'm seeing this here and I'm seeing that there. It's really for us to wake up to the fact that we live on a planet that keeps us alive. And if we continue to tinker with all the bolts of the life support system, we're limiting the amount of time we might be on this planet as a species. And so your questions are wonderful. They're exactly what we're wanting to ask. And the fact that you realize that there may not be answers that I can give you, but answers that you can come to, is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. That I can't tell you your answer for that. I can tell you my answer, but it really doesn't matter, because you have to go out into the world and you have to play with how you want to be and income and all the rest of it. So when you come to a site and somebody says, I want a landscape here. So recently Andrew was invited to Egypt to create a eco village off of an oasis that I think is like 4 or 5 hours off of Cairo. And you can go bigger and bigger with this question. It's like, okay, there's this oasis and it's a fossilized aquifer, and that aquifer has something like 300 or 400 years of water left. Okay. And then you can ask the question, should we have more people there? But as a designer, when you're invited to these things, that question's has already been answered for that project. The question that becomes the values that you bring to this work. Is that something you want to participate in? And this is where you start to really get into, expressing the essence of what's inside of you through or with this tool of permaculture, and going, okay, no, I want to work with native landscapes. I want to work with rehabilitation. I want to take, let's say right now, I think there's 14% left of the native prairie in Canada. So one of the largest in terms of square footage or square kilometer, square mile ecology we have in Canada. We're down to 14% of it. And there's some people that look at that and they go, the calling inside of them, the vocation to be called, says, I have to do that. That's what I want to do with my life's work. And for others, it's, well, I want to become a designer with regenerative land care and permaculture as a tool. And so I'm going to come to these landscapes, and these are the types of landscapes I want to work with. But your questions are helping to form the structure of where you may want to play within this field, or where you may want to take your first step. And I'll say this, after doing this for 12 years, the first step I took is not the second step I took, and it's definitely not the step I ended up with. There's specialties that I really enjoy. There's individuals I really like working with. Right now, I'm kind of having an interesting evolution of really focusing on food security and food sovereignty, because I see what's coming, at least from my perspective. And I go, we're in dire straits when it comes to food. And so right now I've got a big audacious goal to get 10,000 new people engaged with their food security and 1,000 people actively more food secure by year's end. It's my big audacious goal. And I'm partnering with a few people because for me, that's really important. And so every year I do an envisionment process. What do I want to do? Who am I this year? What did I learn last year? What's driving inside of me? And just, I follow my curiosity. So the idea that you're asking these questions, I would continue to follow it. If you haven't read Tao's book on invasives, I would absolutely read that. I would check into Jeff Lawton. Jeff Lawton has a different perspective on this. I would check in and start to read this and start to find the answers you're looking for. Because
I don't know if I'll be able to. Like, I don't know if those answers are out there. It's just, seems like the more I learn about it and the more answers I get, the more confusing the whole thing becomes.
Yeah.
And I'm almost to the point where it's just like I just want to find a place where I can relax into like a comfortable being a comfortable contributor instead of trying to solve. I don't know. I think that part of it is feeling guilty for doing certain things once you realize that they can cause harm. But then also learning that almost everything you do causes harm, and then learning those things that you can take steps to backtrack that a little bit at least, and then to the point where you're not spending your whole life trying to combat every little thing. So like finding that middle ground, I think is where maybe that's the answer that I'll find, is like where I can confidently say that I'm doing enough and also feel not feel overstressed and overworked with my mind about what I am doing in the process. So, but yeah, there's every one of those little questions is kind of like it's another responsibility, I guess. Once you learn the answer, then you're like, okay, well now I have to change my lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out to, and I recognize it, and I still struggle with it, is that our society produces really powerful minds that think a lot, and they think a lot about thinking. And when you have that level of intelligence, you tend to use that as the tool that you bring to everything. Well, I'm going to think about this. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to research. And what I found in being a recovering overthinker is you have to access other aspects of yourself. You have to access the physical aspect of yourself. You have to access the spiritual aspect of yourself. And if this is new to you, then there's some simple practices. A sit spot is a beautiful way to begin. A sit spot is a place to go and sit and be in an environment, and to be in that environment, not be there to think, but be there to be. And the wisdom and the knowledge that comes from that is unbridled. Having worked with Sepp Holzer, who has quite a bit of, get her done energy, and has and we equate get her done to mental energy, but it's not. He has multiple sit spots on every land he's in, and he'll go and he'll sit. And he was joking one time. He was like, Veronica doesn't know where I am because I'm in my sit spot. I'm talking to the only power that's important. She doesn't like that. and I love that. And so it's been a big part of my life to find other ways of being, and at least once or twice a month as I'm gardening, I just lay down in the garden, or I just lay down in the pathway, do something bizarre to anybody else who's watching, but I just be, because we've lost that in humanity in a big way. And I think it's partially why this course exists, why this information exists, and why we're here, is that we've lost that. So, the other thing I wanted to bring to your attention is it may not be more mental energy. It may be other energy you need to explore, and just being, and a spiritual connection with the land, or a spiritual connection with yourself, or a physical connection with the land that has nothing to do with the decision you make or the thoughts you think, but with the physicality of being in a place. And that's why things like braiding sweet grass and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is another beautiful book that really brings in the bigger conversation of how are we in this landscape. And I always go back, and I have a great affinity to the number 42, that life really is anything you want, right? The answer to life, the use, and life, the universe, and everything, according to Douglas Adams, is it's anything you want. It's just how you have this incredible gift that's given to you by your birth in this life. All these atoms and molecules that make you up have never made you up to this point in the history of the universe. They never will again. And each of us has a little psychic fingerprint. We each have an essence. We have a little acorn of what's interesting to us. So we become very curious about the questions you're asking because it's actually directing you. It's like a little X marks the spot. It's like there's gold here. It's like, huh, I'm curious about this. That means there's a place for me to explore. And that for me has been the most valuable piece when it comes to niching. It's like, oh, this is a place to explore. This is actually a golden path for me to find and to bring the gifts that I have innately to the world and to the people around me, and then to continually build upon that. So while I do see the distress that's part of you has in answering these questions, there's also a lot of gold there, and I would lean into the gold.
There's a lot of purpose and trajectory, like just searching for those answers is part of it too. The struggle. Yeah. The connection with Earth, I think that's definitely one, that's what I'm missing. That's one thing I'm missing, is like being out physically. And in the urban environment, it's really difficult to access that. I mean, I can go out in the kind of yard that I have, and I do, especially in the spring and summer. I'm out there a lot, and my mind tends to go wild more in the winter time because of it. I want to be in nature in spring and summer, and I don't want to be in winter sort of person. So it's good. It's good. I just need a place. I need a place to go. That's it.
Yeah.
Maybe find a park. I should put more energy into that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks for letting me take up some of the time with my questions that weren't directly related.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we had the time, right? It's this is office hours for anything. And so like I fill it with conversations about templates and conversations about assignments, because the part of me that's the instructor is like, well, this is office hour time, but you brought a question, and so that's the priority. You bring a question, we discuss the question, and truthfully, discussions are way richer than me going over the points in the assignment. It's like I will. Go ahead.
That's something that I've just to throw another weird thing in, but as I'm a designer and an artist, and I'm also really interested in conversation, but I'm interested in the design aspect, or the form, I guess you could say, of conversation. And it's a very natural thing that I think has arisen. And we could try to look at conversation itself from a permaculture lens too, because if you go into a party or a big group of people, you'll see that no one gets in groups of more than 4 or 5 to talk. You can't have a conversation with people, with more than 2 or 3 people, and have it be naturally effective, which is conversation is a very interesting form of transferring information from one organism to another. And I think that if we study conversation and how it works, we could get a lot of really amazing ideas about nature and how nature and ecosystems communicate and have conversations as well. And I think it's embedded in our own conversations as humans, that there's components of it there. But anyway, yeah, I appreciate the conversation that we've had.
I would direct you to the Way of Council and Heart Circle. Both are phenomenal ways of hosting large conversations, and are based on indigenous practices of listening from the heart, speaking from the heart, being spontaneous. This was really important.
What's the name of the heart?
Heart Circle? I'll send you. I'll put 2 links here. It's called heartcircle.com and the Way of Council. And these were 2 things that I trained in when I was living in a community, because I was so enamored with another way of communicating and conversing. And they're based on the indigenous ways of communicating and conversing, and they're helping bring a mostly mental culture back into a being culture through listening and conversation. So it's very timely that you would bring this up. But generally, we're not trained in these ways of being, and we're specifically trained out of our inherent capacity to be in conversation with smaller and larger amounts of people. So I think both of those would be great places for you to explore and play with. And yeah, just thanks so much for the conversation. I do have to run to my next meeting, but
Yeah, thank you.
really enjoyed this with all of you, and looking forward to seeing your assignments as I get back into marking and then back into the next office hours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good one.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Welcome, Michael.
Bye.
Take care, Jonas.